And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again for you.
And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up in spite of I will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we will rise.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel and my pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. Today, I'm just delighted to welcome you to this Training Institute live workshop. As you might have come to expect with all your favorite conferences, the Training Institutes are now virtual. And although I know we'd all like to be together in person, we are excited to host the virtual Training Institutes and really want to encourage you to continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month through August. Each month, you'll have a choice of 2 back-to-back workshops. So mark your calendars, choose your workshops, and make sure you reserve your place early so that you can attend the workshop that most interests you. Today, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions, post your comments, and share your resources with your colleagues. Our presenters, they definitely want to hear from you. And it is absolutely your participation that will make each of these sessions a success. As a reminder, staff are monitoring the chat and they're going to make sure the facilitators see your questions and comments, so be sure and engage. A few other reminders to include: if you need assistance at any time navigating through these virtual spaces or accessing links to workshops, we do have a live help desk support standing by to assist. We are also providing a certificate of attendance after the completion of each workshop, and all of our workshops are being recorded, so by you participating, you're implying consent. Finally, there will be an ASL interpreter or closed captioning available during each workshop. Those interpreters can be pinned when available for those who require interpretation by hovering over the interpreter's video and selecting the 3 dots. One of the options that will appear is pin video. By selecting the pin video, this video will not move out of view. With our theme, What Could Be? Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures for Children, Youth, Young Adults, and Their Families, all of our sessions will challenge us to envision a future where the voices of children, youth, young adults, and their families are elevated, especially those who are most frequently silenced or marginalized, where we use the best data and research available to challenge ourselves, developing new ideas and approaches that can be implemented to meet the needs of youth and families, and in service of our commitment to social justice and the elimination of disproportionality and disparities. My hope is that today's session will provide you with food for thought as you consider your next steps in creating a vibrant, equitable future for youth with complex needs and their families. Please don't forget to register for next month's workshop. Remember, they're held the first Thursday of every month, and you can visit the institute.umaryland.edu for the full schedule.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. It's on using data for equity, creating and expanding capacity for data-driven decision-making. My name is Jovan Goodman. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm a program specialist here at Evident Change, and I want to offer my colleague, my brilliant colleague, Dr. Charlene Taylor, an opportunity to introduce herself.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Charlene Taylor. I am a senior researcher at Evident Change. Welcome to our workshop today.
Now that we've introduced ourselves, one of the things that we want to do is take some time to recognize the traditional owners of the land in which we speak to you from. I'm speaking to you today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It is the indigenous land of the Potawatomi tribe. Before we move forward, I want to recognize them as the indigenous owners of the land that I speak to you from, and to also recognize their culture, their ancestral lineage, and their contributions to the land before proceeding. Charlene?
Yes, thank you, Jovan. At Evident Change, we are committed to our continued work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as part of that journey, we have started to incorporate land acknowledgements into all of our internal and external meetings. So thank you, Jovan, for that. And I see someone from the chat is joining from the same place I am. I am joining you from Boise, Idaho this morning, the traditional land of the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. So I would like to acknowledge and recognize their contributions to the land, and appreciation for their stewardship of this land throughout the generations. Also, before we go on, I will, and I'll throw it in the chat, if you are interested in finding out about the indigenous people who were the traditional owners where you are, there are a couple of ways you can do that, and I'll put this information in the chat. There is a website, an app called Native Land, and it uses your location to tell you where you are, the indigenous people, the treaties, all of those wonderful things. There's also a 1-800 or 1-855 number that you can text that will also provide that information for you. And I'll put that in the chat for you.
Thanks, Charlene. That's such a good, helpful resource for folks. I just want to introduce our organization a little bit. We are Evident Change. We're a nonprofit that uses data and research to improve our social systems. We ultimately believe that our system should help create and achieve individuals with their greatest potential, and not create barriers to their success. So we inform systems and ultimately change lives. Some of you may be able to recognize the name, the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. Prior to December of 2020, we were actually known as the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, or you may have referred to us as the Children's Research Center. So after about 40 or 50 years, I want to say, we decided to change our name in December, and we thought it was no better time to clearly define and reestablish ourselves in terms of what it means for us to build community with our partners and work in different communities to ultimately inform systems and change lives so that they will be more equitable from the inside out. And so that's who we are. We love to have the opportunity. I see that there's some folks that have already been introducing themselves in chat. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself, share your pronoun, your organization, or what your role is specifically in the training or in the presentation today, that would be great. Charlene, I know you've probably been watching the chat a little bit more than me because I've been speaking. Are you seeing any interesting things yet?
Lots of introductions, thank you. And one of our participants actually pointed out that traditional stewards of the land is probably a more appropriate verbiage rather than owners of the land. So thank you for that, and we will definitely incorporate that in our land acknowledgements going forward. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the words that we used when we first started talking about this was stewards. And I think I might have just mistakenly used the term owner. So I absolutely want to be thoughtful and intentional about that. So thank you. Oh, awesome. Exciting. We see that there's folks all over the country here. Our organization works with 40 other states and 5 other countries. And so you definitely may have heard of our work before. We work in the juvenile justice field. We work in child welfare. We have a social services practice team, and also adult protection services. Anything else you want to add, Charlene, before we move forward?
No, I think we can jump right in.
Awesome. So I'm going to introduce our agenda for today. We're going to start with working with and across difference. some of you may have already read what this presentation is going to be about, but we're going to be walking through our data for equity model and introducing the different phases that are included within the model. One of the foundational things that we start off with is our working with an across difference model, which we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then we will move into introspection phase, which is the very beginning and readiness phases that organizations start with, then collective vision, system improvement, and lastly, we'll have Charlene close us out with continued progress that organizations want to think about within that last phase of the model. So first, wanting to start with working with and across difference, and we want to share a little bit about the model. It was actually developed by Visions Inc. Heard of Visions Inc. It's a wonderful organization of individuals who began to come together to think about how to include individuals from different parts of society who had not been included. So in other words, oppressed individuals for different reasons, and being able to come together and have conversation at that time and dialogue around working with and across difference. And so we know that the multiple differences that we all have, it ranges from race to ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, class, all sorts of privileges, and I'm sure that you all will list a number in the chat. One of the things that we've done as an organization is start off in saying, before we can actually begin to have dialogue around race and different forms of oppression, we need to start with a model that helps us establish shared language and build community, especially a model that creates language that is going to be inclusive for all of those that are going to be a part of the conversation. And so as you think about this model, we always use this visual of a bridge. And what we like to say is that oftentimes we are working with others, and most of the time we have some differences. There are times that we have similarities as well. But if you think about the clients that you might be working with, sometimes the differences may create barriers to communication or barriers to our ability to actually work together and progress. And so that is kind of what this bridge symbolizes. A part of the working with and across difference model are the multicultural guidelines and agreements. And so these are some that our organization used to begin to establish language and communicate across difference. But we recommend that this is a foundational piece in terms of beginning the work. And we're suggesting that this is a great opportunity to use working with and across difference, but we are also open to other models that may be used as well to establish shared language. And so Charlene and I are going to quickly just go over some of these and kind of bounce back and forth to let you know what we mean when we say different things. And this is actually something that we use as an organization. So it's something that we kind of talk about quite freely. And so I'll get us started with try on. I kind of love this one because it reminds me of what my mother used to say, put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? I know some other folks might have heard that. Before we put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we have to take off our own. So a lot of times we are coming to the conversation and we're listening from our own perspective, right? We haven't quite taken off our shoes yet. So demonstrating trying on and having the ability to try on is to genuinely do that in an intentional way and to listen, to actually hear and understand another's perspective before responding, or sometimes there's defense or other things of that nature, instead of actually having the opportunity to truly try on. And so that's one of the phrases that we use a lot. And when we say it, Charlene and others in my organization would know exactly what we need.
We lost your audio, Jovan. I'll jump in on the next one.
Go ahead.
That's okay. I'll jump in on the next one because I think it's a great extension of try on, which is the idea that it's okay to disagree, but it's not okay to blame or shame or attack others or ourselves as we start to talk about our own internalized biases and the ways in which we interact within and across difference. Sometimes there's a lot of defensiveness that's associated with that, and maybe even some embarrassment in terms of really kind of coming to terms with our own biases. So one of the things that we really lift up with the multicultural guidelines is this idea that we're going to have disagreements. To the extent that you communicate with people across difference, you're going to disagree. That's bound to happen. It's very predictable. And it's okay to disagree, but it's not okay to blame or shame other people. And so we want to give each other some grace and some acceptance around different opinions and different points of view.
Awesome. So I'm going to go with the next one, which is practice self-focus and using I statements. Just remembering when we're beginning to have conversations across difference, it's very important to speak from a place of I and focus on your own perspective, your own experiences. Sometimes what may happen is that there's a conversation that occurs and it is presented as a we or the department or some of those really larger organizational terms that sometimes can be used that can create often more of a distance, especially when we're not speaking specifically for ourselves when it comes to articulating different beliefs and different opinions about specific topics.
The next one is being aware of intent and impact. And as I learned the multicultural guidelines, this was the one that really sort of resonated with me. And we call these multicultural guidelines because we use them as sort of a bucket for talking about how to communicate across difference. But I think this is true whether we're talking about race or ethnicity or anything. And it's this idea that regardless of what we intend, sometimes what comes out can be experienced differently. And so being aware that oftentimes our intentions don't necessarily get communicated the way that we think that they do. And so being aware of our intent, but especially being aware of our impact and the way that our impact, particularly from positions of privilege, may impact others in a conversation when they don't share that same position. And so I think this is a really important one to think about as we talk about using data for equity and bringing in other voices as we define our organization's missions and goals and evaluate success, is thinking about how our intent, the intent of our services, as well as the impact. And sometimes what we intend isn't always what happens. So I think this intent and impact is a really big one that can really inform a lot of what we do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlene. It's actually one of my favorites as well. The next one is notice both the process and the content. The content is usually what we say. The process is usually how we say or the methods for in which we say or different processes that might be in place. And this really speaks to tending to both of those. And so when we're communicating different information around data for equity, we want to think about the content, but we want to think about the process in which we present the content as well. We want to think about whose voice is being escalated in presenting the information and who's not, who is feeling like they are a part of the conversation in terms of inclusivity and who might not be. And so that's really what we want to emphasize during notice, both the process and the content.
And then practicing both and thinking. I think one of the potentially most troublesome words in the English language is but. Because oftentimes when you say something and then you say but, you've essentially negated everything that you said before the word but. So the multicultural guidelines really encourage us to be able to hold multiple truths at one time. This can be true and this can be true. And it sort of changes the perspective of the conversation, and it really increases inclusivity in terms of the people participating in the conversations. I encourage you to try that next time that you're talking to someone. It doesn't matter the content of the conversation, but the next time you feel yourself about to say the word but, say and instead, and think about how you experience that yourself and how the other person experiences it too, because it's really a way to validate different perspectives and different points of view. And then lastly, we have confidentiality, which is really just sort of an umbrella over all of this. Just the idea that our stories are our stories, and what happens in conversations when it's someone else's experience, it's their experience to tell. And that's really one of the things that we talk about a lot with Data for Equity, is the importance of including all of those voices. If we want all of the stories to be told, we want them to be told by the people who live them. All right.
So one of the things that we want to start thinking about when we're working with an organization is first, how we begin to define some of the concepts individually and interpersonally. And so this is a journaling activity, and feel free to go ahead and journal, but we're going to keep going because we won't necessarily have the time to go through this, but this might be a journaling activity that is specifically helpful for building a culture and practice of equity. And so it really asks some questions around when you're thinking about your earliest encounter with race. If you think about who was there, how old were you, what were the messages that you heard earlier on about race, negative, positive, or neutral? What were you taught, or what was caught in terms we're able to take away earlier on in regards to race? And when we do this with organizations, one of the, we get a lot of folks that say they have aha moments, and we actually share this in a smaller group setting eventually. And we get a lot of folks that start to say, I realized that this was something that I was told when earlier on when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and this is how it might still affect me to this day. And so it's a really helpful journaling exercise when we really want to just start building a foundation to start having these conversations. You have anything to add, Charlene?
Nope.
Okay.
On that one. And the second part of that then is, once you have that own internal reflection, is to share how that earliest memory or encounter with sort of really explicitly understanding race influences your current analysis, and shapes, especially in the context of your work, may shape your leadership, the engagement that you have with the community, and the data that you collect. Because all of our experiences are had through a lens that we come with. And so it's important for us to think about where that lens comes from, and how that lens then impacts what we do, and shapes how we interact with people, and shapes how we define success. And that's a big part of Data for Equity as well.
Yes, I see there's a comment that folks that are really loving the multicultural guidelines, and we will definitely add that into the chat. I have it saved on my computer, so we'll definitely add that in. Thank you for that good feedback. And so ultimately, we start off with the working with and across difference, and really create that foundation and that culture for an inclusive engagement. And sure, we might have steps where we up and we miss things along the way, but we have a shared language that really helps us create that dialogue for misses in communication that happens along the way. And now what we want to do is really talk about the different phases of the Data for Equity model that we begin to explore with an organization. We start with really that introspection, and that is really when we're asking the question around, what is your data and equity infrastructure? What is the foundation? Who's going to be on the equity team? Who are the folks that we should be contacting, communicating with? Are those the right folks? Is another question that we want to ask. And then we're going to bounce these back and forth, and Charlene's going to talk about collective vision.
Yeah, so collective vision is really this idea of, how do we work together to reconcile our different perspectives and establish goals? Oftentimes, the goals of an organization are established by leadership, sometimes by staff, but sometimes it's important, or not sometimes, it's always important, to include the voices of the people who are going to be most impacted by our work. Not how do we define success from our lens, but how do they define success? Oftentimes, social service organizations come in and help with very good intentions from sort of a deficit mindset. What is missing in the lives of the people we work with that we can provide? one thing that collective vision helps us to figure out and to look at from a different perspective is to focus on the strengths that those clients already have and what is success defined by from their perspective. And that's where the collective vision process can really help us to flesh that out. And that will determine and can help determine how we interact with folks. And as we think about evaluating our programs, it can help determine the data that we collect, our definitions of success, and what we ultimately find in terms of telling the story of our program and of our clients.
The third phase is really around system improvement. How do we critically examine our systems? How do we make the changes to our systems? So as Charlene said, is after we've defined what that collective vision is, how do we really define how we actually change our systems and make improvement? And then how do we really measure that improvement, right? Another thing that we might think about in the system improvement phase is this is a phase where we might decide that we want to pivot. We might decide that there are different challenges or concerns that we want to address in this phase that we really need to have crucial conversations around in order to improve our system.
And then continued progress is the importance of evaluation. As I'll talk about a little bit later. And I said this by accident in a webinar, and one of our team members was like, I love that. And it was this idea of don't wait to evaluate. That as we think about the work that we do, the impact that we want to have, the implementation process of what we're doing, evaluation should really be part and parcel of all of that. How did we reach our objectives? Was there a problem during the implementation process that maybe impacted whether we were able to reach our objectives? And if there was, what can we do about that? How can we change? How can we shift? And so thinking about those different measures of success and those different measures and those different objectives that we outline in the collective visioning process, and continued progress is about how we reach those. And if we didn't, what do we need to do differently as we move forward? So the data for equity model really gives us this idea of building and evaluating and implementing all of our programs and doing that from a data-driven perspective. Data is everywhere around us in the work that we do. And so what this model really tries to help us do is to figure out what pieces of data can help us really define our mission, define our goals and objectives, and define our outcomes, and define success. And how can we use all of that to tell the story of our work and to tell the story of the clients that we work with.
So we want to move in and begin speaking about what exactly happens in the introspection phase of an organization's work. When we think about the word introspection, what we are defining is really a reflective looking inward as an organization, an examination of one's own thoughts and feelings. And that's happened a lot in the working with and across different phases. And now what we're doing is bringing it all together and saying, as an organization, where are we in terms of readiness to begin this work? And so ultimately, one of the things that we introduce in this first phase is our data for equity self-assessment. It's a set of questions organized by 3 topic areas that we think are crucial: equity infrastructure, leadership and organizational capacity, and data. And so this assessment is really designed to assess an agency's initial capacity to begin work, establish realistic work plan and goals, and then officiate those benchmarks. One of the reasons why we decided to create this self-assessment is that we were wanting to help organizations decide exactly where they are. What we noticed is that organizations often began jumping into the work without really thinking about how realistic they are in each phase. And when we say that, we also want to just hold the space that data for equity is really about a continuum. No organization is there. There's continuous work and continuous enhancement. And so instead of our organization seeing themselves as we have arrived and we are at a destination, we like for organizations to understand themselves in a journey. And so where they are on the journey is what's most important. And so this is a realistic way for us to have this conversation. And so now what we're going to do is just talk a little bit about the questions that we have on this assessment. And we thought that we would allow you to try it on by completing the polls. And so what you're going to do is you're going to read each question, and I'm going to review them all shortly. And you're going to kind of select what you're thinking about in terms of what your organization currently has, right? And so as you're going through these, you can just kind of select what you think are areas where my organization is working on this, or we're doing a good job in this particular item. So that first question is really around your organization having a shared language for engagement in those equity conversations. And so whether that language is working with an across difference or another model that you're using, or a model that your organization actually developed, that is completely reasonable here. Next is really around the staff being knowledgeable and feel essential when considering their equity efforts. So the staff understand the importance of the goal and the missions that you all are trying to accomplish. Next is really around training that specifically focused on racism, classism, and other forms of oppression. And so making sure that that staff have that necessary training, and that staff have training that is very specific to the types of oppression that clients are experiencing that they're serving within the organization. We thought that that was really important to emphasize. The next question is really around having routine and intentional structured space and conversation to have to engage in different conversations around a number of different subject matters involving diversity, oppression, and other forms of oppression. So having the ability to have those different conversations. We know that everyone might not want to be a part of the core team or engage specifically in some of the work, or be a part of leadership, but being able to have a place where staff can go to have these these particular conversations, that feel safe. And this next question is really around staff's ability to engage in equity conversations across the organization. So we don't just have staff engaging, or we don't just have people of color engaging in these conversations. At any level, you're not able to opt out of the conversation. So everyone is willing and equally invested in the equity goals and mission as a part of the organization. This next one is really around staff having the ability to actually observe that there's an equity lens being applied to different areas in terms of program design, review, and monitoring. And then this next question is really around leadership's ability to be explicit around building a culture of equity. And we see that this is demonstrated in their management decisions. And so, Charlene, for some reason, I can't see this last question, but I can just look at the question that's actually on the slide. So this last question, although I can't see it, it's our agency has goals to hire, recruit, and engage diverse talent. And that's really incorporating that human resources lens and perspective. Just wanted to check in with the chat. Thanks. Sounds like we're getting some good feedback. Charlene, do you have anything to add so far in terms of equity infrastructure questions?
Yeah. As I'm looking at the poll results roll in, and thank you all so much for participating. What we're seeing in these answers is very similar to what we see with the different agencies that we work with. Lots of places have training on equity matters and that sort of thing. But what we don't see very much is that agencies hold these intentional conversations on a more regular basis around how equity plays into their work and how that might change and shift the things that they do. One of the things about this agency self-assessment. These are all the questions in that particular section. Each one of these questions in the actual assessment is answered on a Likert scale. And so you can sort of pick your degree of agreement for each one of these. And this entire piece will give you a better idea and picture of where your organization has some strengths in their equity work and where there might be some places of growth on that equity journey. From our perspective, as folks that come in to help, this helps us to understand what support we can provide your agency around having those conversations, incorporating an equity lens and an intersectional lens into your work, both internally and externally.
Awesome. Thanks for adding that. So this is the way that we just want to introduce the questions, but as you'll see, the self-assessment looks a little different, but these are the actual questions on the assessment. And now we have another poll for you all to engage in. There's 6 questions, and this is more specific to leadership and organizational capacity. And so we're going to let you fill these out a minute. All right, and so we see that that first question is really around, these are really technical questions. Have you identified specific equity-related goals and objectives? That next question is really around if these goals and objectives are being measured routinely. And then we're asking a question around identifying an implementation team that will guide this and support the agency's efforts. And this next question is around leadership. Leadership is engaging the external stakeholders from the community to inform and discuss agency equity goals. And so this would not be just on a corporate level or a funding level, engaging all of those external stakeholders from community and having a diverse representation of that when we're thinking about what the appropriate equity goals are for the population that we're serving. Incorporating feedback from staff into decision-making related to equity is a huge one. I think that's one that sometimes organizations can miss. And we sometimes say, well, have you collected feedback from staff? Also, one of the big things is, have you collected feedback from the clients that you're serving, the individuals that you are going to be making the goals and the work plan around? And so collecting that feedback from both staff and your clients is going to be crucial, especially the clients that you're serving from that community, because what we've learned is when we make assumptions around what that feedback is, we're actually engaging in what may be elitist behaviors. And so we want to ask the people that we're serving about their feedback in terms of the services that we're providing. You have anything to add there, Charlene? I'm going to check out the chat for a minute.
Sorry, muted. No, nothing specific. That was great.
If you don't see any of these things yet in your organization, when you see the self-assessment, there will be an option to just select no. This is not occurring at our organization yet. And that's nothing to feel ashamed about, but it helps us accurately assess where you all are and what goals we need to work on or what goals need to be put in. You aren't necessarily capturing the full length of the assessment here. We just want to present you with some of these questions to begin thinking about. So thanks for whoever asked that, because that's a really good point. You will be able to account for that with the self-assessment when you actually see it.
I think that's a really great point as well, Jovan, because one of the things, as she said, this gives us an idea and gives you as an organization an idea of exactly where you are. And that's pretty important because one of the things that the research on diversity, equity, and inclusion is pretty consistently reveals is that most people overestimate their own abilities to communicate within and across difference and their level of expertise in terms of equity and inclusion matters. And so oftentimes we'll see agencies want to dive into a sort of deeper equity goal when they don't have some of those basic structures in place to even have conversations around equity and how that plays out both internally and externally. So that's where the assessment really helps us. So those answers of none are just as important as the answers of we're doing this all the time, because that sort of tells us where you are and helps to really try to start to formulate some of those equity goals.
Thanks, Charlene. And now we're going to move with our third section of the self-assessment, which is more focused on data. Before we begin, we wanted to have a little interaction with you, and we wanted you to think about the term data. And if you think about that term data, what comes to mind? If you could list your answer in 1 or 2 words in the chat, what do you think about when it comes to data? I see evidence, analyze, disaggregated, measurable, numerical, outcomes, qualitative, lots of evidence, support for current purpose, objective. Oh, I love that question. Does it fit the community that I serve? I love that question. Explanation. Absolutely. One of the things that we learned when we began to ask about data is that we got a lot of different opinions around what data was. And for some, data has been a word that can be very traumatic, right? Especially when we have been when we've been the person on the receiving end that different decisions have been made according to data. If those the decisions that were made were not necessarily the ones that we agree with, right? And so when we're thinking about these specific questions around data infrastructure and capacity, these are the questions. We're not going to do a poll because what you'll see in the self-assessment is that the answers are very descriptive and they're very detailed, and it wasn't quite fit for a poll. So we just wanted you all to have the opportunity to try on the first 2 polls. But really, these are the questions that we asked around data infrastructure, and we would be getting very detailed and asking different questions from your organization regarding your agency's information system, how well data is currently collected, if there are current gaps in data. We will be asking questions around data integrity, different data governance structures. Charlene, I know this is particularly your area of expertise, if you want to add anything here.
Yeah, as I'm looking through the chat, I had lots of thoughts. You know, as Jovan said, I'm a researcher by trade, so data is my thing. And one of the things that as I was looking through the responses and looking at some of the trends and qualitative versus quantitative, does it fit the community? And one person, Linda, said, doesn't tell the whole story. And I think that's one of the things that we really wanted. That was one of the reasons we really took this perspective in talking about data for equity and really want to have a conversation around what data is, because oftentimes, as Jovan said, when we think about data, we think about numbers, and the numbers don't tell the whole story. The numbers can tell you what's happening, they don't tell you why. And so that's one of the things when we talk about data for equity, we talk with agencies about all of the things that are data. Yes, they're the numbers of how many people come to your program and how many people you serve and frequency rates and things like that. But data is also those client satisfaction surveys. Data is also all kinds of things. It's all of any of the information that you have about what you do and how you do it is data. And so the data for equity process is how can we take all of that information and learn about our organization, about our agency, and figure out, are we doing work from an equity lens? Are we doing work that provides what we're hoping to provide? And if not, what needs to change? And you're absolutely right. We can't always tell that just from the numbers. So data is not just the numbers, but it also, as Sarah said, it provides the context. And so it can provide the context for what those numbers can tell us about our organization's activities. Again, both internally and externally, because part of this is, as an internal organization, how do we do our work internally from an equity lens, and then how do we do that externally as well?
Yes, there's a number of interesting comments in the chat, and I wish that we all could unmute and share, because you all are exactly where we want you to be, and I bet you all have a lot more to add to this. Ultimately, what we want to really challenge organizations with thinking about and understanding is what we measure and how we measure it is a reflection of what we value. And so there are all types of different scenarios that we have, or examples that we have around this, because data can be racialized, right? And so really thinking about when we are in this very introductory phase of our model, how do we want to measure some of our things, or what do we want to begin measuring that is going to be a better story to tell for some of our funders, or how do we begin to get funding based on the data that we want to start collecting, because we feel that this is more valuable to the community based on the feedback that we've received. And so this is something that we always want to remind our organizations that we're working with. And these are just some reflections that you might be thinking about. You might be thinking about how the agency self-assessment can help your organization in its introspection phase. You might be thinking about what actions or what are the next steps that leadership need to take in order to enhance organizational capacity. And some of you might be very excited to use this self-assessment and begin thinking about where your organization currently is and creating some goals around that. So our next phase is collective vision. Take us away, Charlene, because I feel like I've been running my mouth.
Yes, the next sort of piece of that little puzzle that we showed you at the beginning, after the introspection phase, where we figure out exactly where an organization is around equity, around data, around leadership and internal capacity, the next piece is collective vision. How do we decide what it is that we value? How do we decide what questions we want answers to, and what will help us tell the story of our work and tell the story of the community that we work with? So if we go to the next slide, one of the first things that we do in this collective visioning piece is around creating this shared language. That's part of what the multicultural guidelines are. But particularly when we talk about data, there are some things that we want to make sure we're all looking at the same way. And whether we're talking about assessments that we use or information that we collect, all of these pieces, these 4 pieces, are really important. So we want to make sure that our data is accurate, that the information we're getting is an accurate reflection of what's happening. If we don't have that accurate reflection, we can't tell the right story, or the accurate story. Consistent, that if we're collecting information on one person, we're collecting information on every person that comes through. So again, that consistency helps us to get a better view of the story that we're trying to tell. And then equity. What do we mean by equity? Oftentimes, equity can mean access. Equity can mean outcomes. It depends on how we want to look at it. And so having that conversation around which equity pieces are most important for us to understand about our work and about our clients will help us in terms of determining what our objectives should be in this data for equity process. And then utility. What is the usefulness of this process? What kind of information are we trying to get from it, and what are we trying to learn? And so going through this activity, this sort of collective visioning activity where we start to think about what we do and how we do it, these pieces of shared language are important. The next slide asks you to think about, and we'd love to do this in small groups, and maybe this is something you could take back with you. But as you think about the work in the organization where you are, and you reflect on a recent planning or strategic meeting, think about who was in the conversation, whose voices were missing from the conversation or from the decision. How were the decisions made? Was it a consensus? Was it a majority? Did leadership make the decision and tell everyone else what was going to happen? And how or was equity intentionally considered? These are all of the types of things that we talk about and think about when it comes to collective visioning, because the answers to these questions are going to determine the answers. If you only have certain people at the table, only certain voices, certain values will be lifted. And so you want to think about what was missing, who was missing, and how you're making decisions. I'd love to share with you all a real world example of sort of collective visioning. And it's something that we wrestled with at our own organization at Evident Change. And I think we'll have someone drop this in the chat, because we've also used this in other trainings as an exercise for people to start to think about this collective visioning process and what our values are around equity and how that plays into what we do. So just really quickly, what we did, we had an issue where, and this is probably something a lot of you are familiar with, the health insurance company that was providing insurance for our organization was changing. The rates were getting too high, so we had to make a decision on what other company were we going to use. And so we wanted to make sure that we made that decision with an equity lens, thinking about collective visioning and thinking about introspection. And so in the activity, the objective is that you're a member of a core team in charge of selecting the most appropriate health insurance plan for your agency. The premiums are increased. Your agency has offered some resources to lessen the burden of staff, but cannot absorb the entire cost of the increased premiums. Staff will have to contribute more than last year. Your job is to work together to figure out the best way to allocate the remaining cost increase. So you have limited information, and that's one of the things people struggle with in this activity. We only have so much information. Well, that's the way things happen in real time. You have so much information and you have to make a decision. So the information we provide is the race of the staff and their salary. And based on those pieces of information, you're asked to figure out, how do we determine who picks up more of the slack in this cost increase? And it's a really interesting exercise, because it forces you to think about, what are your values? How do you determine who's going to carry the burden of more of a cost increase? So as I said, we're going to put that in the chat, and I'd really encourage you to use that exercise and have some conversations around how you might have that conversation and how you might make that decision. That's collective visioning. That's determining what's our objective, how are we going to get there, and how are we going to get there in the most equitable way possible. We can go to the next slide, Jovan. So when you think about your data for equity team internally, who's on that team? Because they have a pretty important role as they start to think about what your objectives are and how you're going to measure success. Who has decision-making power? What's the role clarity? One of the things that we highly advise is to have people from all levels of the organization as part of this data for equity team, because every level of the organization has a different perspective. And if leadership is making decisions about line staff's jobs, their activities without their input, oftentimes those two things are just not really aligned. So you want to make sure that you have diverse voices and experience, not only the people who are doing the work, but the people that are impacted by the decision makers. And I think that's one of the places where we oftentimes don't include voices. And when we do, we include them after the fact. If you think about your own organization, where you work or where you've worked in previously, probably a lot of you used client satisfaction surveys. Usually you do that at the end, after they've gone through all of your services, maybe they've graduated your program, whatever that looks like, and then you ask them to retrospectively look back and say what worked and what didn't. That's great, and it gives you some really good information. But if they say, well, you guys provided A, B, and C, and what we really needed was X, Y, and Z, it would have been great to have that information at the front when you were trying and starting to decide what services you were going to actually offer. And so that's the importance of having those diverse voices and diverse experiences all the way through the planning process, and that's collective visioning. trying to decide what's the best way for your organization to actually provide the services and meet the needs of the community. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that community voices are heard. The other piece that's important about collective visioning is transparency. How are decisions being made, and can everyone see that process? Even if everyone doesn't agree with the decisions in the end, transparency really makes it a lot easier for people to accept that decision and at least understand what happened. And it allows you to get some feedback on whether there was something missing in that decision-making process. All right, next slide, please. So as we work together, our DEI team at Evident Change has some different phrases that they use. And one of them is building our collective emotional muscle. Early on, when we talked about the multicultural guidelines and with the agency self-assessment, we asked how well your agency actually holds space to have intentional conversations around racism, privilege, oppression, all of those other isms that we know occur in the world. And our ability to do that is our emotional muscle, building an intentional, equitable community. A couple of the ways that we do that, having those multicultural guidelines, making sure that everybody knows them, understands them, and uses them in those internal and external discussions. Having shared agreements as to the process and the content and how you're going to come to the decisions that you're trying to get to. Along with those shared agreements, having a shared language. We have lots of very intentional conversations around privilege and oppression, microaggressions, all of those kinds of things. They're not comfortable. When I first got to Evident Change, and I've worked in universities, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, I've worked in lots of places that have done social justice or helping type of work. I've never worked in a place where we had as intentional conversations about privilege and oppression and how that works internally as well as externally in terms of the work that we do. They're uncomfortable conversations, but I can tell you that for me as a professional in that setting, they've made a world of difference in the way that I work internally with the folks at Evident Change and externally. It's changed the way I look about the way I think about and look at my work. One of the things that I think we can sometimes fall into is this trap of saying, you know, we have experience and education and we have all of this expertise, and so we know how to help. And I think, again, intent versus impact, it comes from a good, very well-intentioned place. But oftentimes that can be what we call a dysfunctional rescue. Instead of helping someone learn to build their own capacity to help themselves, we come in, swoop in, and fix everything. And that's one of those pieces where it's well-intentioned, we think we're doing the right thing, but if we're not including the voices of those who are impacted, we may not be doing it in the right way. And so that's part of this collective visioning, and part of that is building our emotional muscle to talk about it, and to be real with ourselves as to what we're doing and what's working and what's not working. Again, we've got another slide on the multicultural guidelines. You guys will get these slides, and we just wanted to remind you that's part of that's part of that collective visioning, is making sure that we keep those sort of upfront as we think about our processes. Another thing to think about is building consensus. We know that every decision isn't going to be 100% agreed upon by everyone who's in that decision-making party. And the more people you get at the table, the more difficult it is to get consensus. One of the things that we use is this gradients of agreements type of this sort of gradients of agreement line when we're talking about and thinking about decision making, starting at no way, no how, not going to happen, all the way to I love it. And so as we go through decision making, we ask people to sort of rate yourself with this particular decision. Where are you on a 1 to 5? One, that helps us to figure out the level of consensus. But again, it can also help to give us a perspective as to where the problems might be. Where might we be missing something, maybe not looking at things the right way or not including everybody in the conversation. This gradients of agreement idea is a really good way, or a really good tool to use during that collective visioning process as we decide what are our objectives, what kinds of things are we going to measure, what are our definitions of success. All of those things are questions and conversations that everyone at the table should think about and talk about, and that we should figure out where are they on these gradients of agreement. All right, we're going to move on to system improvement. We just got our 30 minutes remaining flag here. So Jovan's going to talk to you quickly about system improvement.
Yes, which ultimately means 15 minutes remaining because we want to have 15 minutes left for you all to ask questions. And I think I saw a really good question around the equity exercise that Charlene was speaking to us about. And so if you could hold that question, we will definitely answer it more during our Q&A time. All right, so as you have kind of worked through or heard some of the elements of the 3 phases of the data for equity model, are you all thinking of, is there any particular work that you're thinking of? Is there anything that you have questions around? What are you thinking of? What does this kind of get you to thinking of in terms of after kind of reviewing the first 3 phases of the model? A lot of times we get some interesting stuff here where we have folks say, well, I'm thinking of hiring someone to particularly monitor this work. And we hear all kinds of things. And obviously, because there's so many folks in here today, we're not sure if everybody has something to add into the chat, but we are also available if you all have questions after. Our organization has a long way to go. Don't feel bad about that. We all, just when we think as an organization that we are getting somewhere and doing well, we also have our struggles. And that's what that system improvement phase is about, is really, how do we really pivot? How do we really address those challenges? And so here are the system components that we really think are crucial in having in place to really improve the system. And sometimes what we find is that organizations might be missing some of these. We want to make sure that there's a clear mission and vision. I'm just going to talk about a few of these. We want to make sure that the external partners are at the table and also aligned with our vision. We want to have effective leadership that's a part of the conversation and invested in the work. We want to have policies that align with our practice, right? We want staff to be able to have those experiences and clients to have the experiences that are meaningful and them feel safe enough to really open up to us and give us that feedback so that we can truly improve the system and make change. We want to have some collective visioning around how we define success. Right. And that goes back to what you all brought up that was really important around data. Lastly, I would say that this piece is really important because we can do all the work. And if we have a prevailing agency culture that kind of overrides the work, it is very difficult for us to move forward. And so when we began working with organizations, we asked a lot around this piece, and some of it we don't find out until we're actually in and doing the work, but only you all know what your agency culture is. And that is really the foundation of how a lot of this work happens, is if the culture is going to be one that's supportive. All right. Ultimately, we feel that there is a very clear process that you want to think about when you're thinking about system improvement. We want to ensure that you're setting the stage properly. And then you're analyzing the data. And you're setting the stage with having that shared language, right? Those shared goals, the understanding of those goals and the metrics in place. And then you're analyzing the data, ensuring that collective vision that is woven into the process. And then you're able to implement changes after that there's a collective vision. And we want to make sure that there's an effective CQI process in place in order to measure, review, and reflect, because our ultimate goal is to not only collect, but to also create a data for equity infrastructure that's going to be sustainable. Charlene, did you want to add anything here?
No, just that that system improvement we have it as sort of its own section, and the same thing with continued progress. But it's something that should be happening all the time. Thinking about how this idea, this lens of evaluating what we do. Evaluation isn't something that should happen at the end. It's something that should happen all of the time. So thinking about how we make all of these decisions and making sure that we're doing so with an equity lens, that's all part of system improvement.
Awesome. I always ask Charlene for her perspective because she's really the expert at data. All right. And so what we wanted to do is really create a visual, because if you're thinking at this point, you know what, I've heard these different phases and I'm a little unsure about how to differentiate between these phases. And I also want to know what specifically happens in each phase. So here are some examples. In the introspection phase, you might begin with the process map. That's when we're going to really explore the data landscape. This is a time where we really want to begin to think about if there's an internal culture that is going to be supportive of the work and what might need to happen if there's some challenges around that. In terms of collective vision, Charlene did a good job of really laying out what that creating that shared language should look like, building the metrics, and then creating those equity goals that are inclusive of the organization and the population that we're serving. System improvement, there's some specific tasks in this section related to analysis, measurement, and evaluation, iteration and improvement that we think are crucial in this phase that we just want to make sure that we're very clear about, that aren't necessarily captured in the introspection and the collective vision phases. And here are some best practices that we have that we want to leave you all with in terms of setting the stage for shared guidelines. We want to emphasize holding the discomfort when there are different opinions and perspectives. The only way we really get to change is if we have some of those critical and really difficult conversations. And so it's going to require us as leaders and as others who are a part of this work to really hold that discomfort that we might feel, and navigate that and discern or assess how much of it is coming from a place of privilege, how much of it might be coming from a place of oppression. But holding that discomfort in this particular phase is going to be important as we improve the system, being aware of transparency, scale, and impact. And this is just a last reminder that data is a reflection of the organizations that collect and use it. We're going to spend the last few moments before our Q&A thinking about what that continued progress phase would look like in our data for equity model.
Yes, I'm going to talk to you about continued progress. And as you know, we've been asking you all to put questions in the chat, and I just put in a big answer because Karen asked about intersectionality. And I know we have some time left over for questions at the end. I just wanted to make sure I lifted that up so that we do not forget it, because it is a huge piece of the data for equity work that we do. As I said in my response in the chat, that could be its own 2-hour presentation talking about intersectionality. So we definitely will come back to that. But with continued progress, it's really this idea of continuing to evaluate and thinking about, again, how we evaluate. It's not just enough to say, this is something that we're looking at, and then later we'll look at the outcome. But think about what are the questions we need to be asking to make sure that not only is our content done with an equitable lens, but that our process has an equitable lens as well. Next slide, please, Jovan. I'm gonna put you on the spot here for a second. I want you all to think about New Year's resolutions. We've all made them. My birthday's in February, so I always make them in February because I say that that's the beginning of my new year, and it gives me the whole month of January to get geared up for this big change that I'm going to make every year, right? Have you made New Year's resolutions, Jovan? I'm sure you have.
Yes.
And did they work?
Yes, mine do.
Okay. Why do yours work?
Just because I'm pretty anal and I will pretty much shame myself if they don't.
All right, all right. Mine, I had trouble with New Year's resolutions for a long time, and I probably did them the way most other people do them, which is I think about the end. Where do I want to be? I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to, start working out. Whatever these things are. And oftentimes they don't work because I'm so focused on the outcome that I haven't thought about the process. And when I started finding more success was when I started changing those resolutions from outcome driven to process driven to, okay, this is where I want to get to. And that's great. I'll think about that later. But in the meantime, what are the steps I have to take to get there? What are those small, tangible things that I need to do every day so that 6 months from now, I can say, yes, I hit that goal. Yes, I reached that outcome. And so when we think about system improvement, we want to think about it in the same way. We have long-term outcomes. We have places that we want our clients to be when all of our services and interventions are done. But we also want to think about and look at and evaluate the process. How are we going to get there? And are there things about our process that may impede our ability to actually get to that outcome? And so when we think about system improvement and continuous progress, it's evaluating and assessing all of those things. So when we think about and talk about system improvement, next slide, please, our core components of a CQI process, you guys are all probably really familiar with, as we talk about it in this way: plan, do, check, and adjust. And so we have it as squares, but it really could just be sort of this circle because we see it as something that should continually be happening. And we're not just, you notice that checking is not the end. And so oftentimes when we think about evaluation, that's the end. We check and see, how did we do? But if we didn't do very well and we didn't check along the way, then we have no idea what happened. We don't know why we were successful or why we were unsuccessful. And so that's why we've sort of switched up the way we think about this. And you check what you're doing and then adjust. Jovan talked a couple of times about the ability to pivot, the ability to say, we thought we were doing this and we thought that was the right way to go, but maybe we need to turn it a little bit this way because we're not getting at exactly what we want. And so that's a more effective way to think about continuous quality improvement, is this idea of planning, doing something, checking in the middle, and then adjusting on the fly. And thinking about evaluation not so much as a one-time process or a one-time activity that happens at the end of your services, but as an ongoing process that you incorporate into the everyday business of what you do and how you do it. And then keeping equity at the focus of that and making sure that there isn't anything that's going on in your process that might contribute to inequitable outcomes or inequitable access for the clients that you're serving. Next slide. So when we talk about defining and measuring success, this sort of incorporates all of the pieces we've talked about with introspection and collective vision, but this idea that how we define success and how we define progress should be developed collaboratively by the staff and by the clients. Again, we don't want to engage in any of that dysfunctional rescue where we come in and tell people what they need and give them what we think they need. We could be right, but we might not be. And so if we don't have those voices as part of the conversation that defines that helps us to outline how we define success and progress, we might be missing the boat someplace. So that's one of the most important parts of defining progress, is making sure you have all of the voices at the table. CQI and evaluation happens at all stages of system improvement, all the way through, from implementation all the way through the end. We want to be evaluating continuously. And this is something that gets lifted up when we think about this from an equity perspective, examining both the intended as well as the unintended consequences of our interventions, because we're all well-intentioned people who want to help the folks that we work with. We think about, this is what we're doing and this is what we're trying to do. But what about some of those things that happen as a result of your activities, of your interventions that are not what you planned for? Oftentimes, that's where we see those inequitable outcomes. And so it's important to, as we think about evaluation, think about what are our intended outcomes? How do we measure those? And what else do we need to look for? What else could be happening? I was having this conversation with some folks I was working here with in Idaho, and one of the questions that they asked themselves was, think about the group that could be most negatively impacted by what we're about to do, and what would that look like? And then what do we need to do to try to make sure that that doesn't happen? So some things to think about with some just different CQI activities. And this is another way to get us to start to think about that data is not always numbers. Things like case reviews, things like focus groups, not just at the end, but all the way through. Impact analysis. All of these are different ways for us to gather data about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And it allows us to continuously improve the services that we're offering and continuously examine what we're doing with that equity lens. All right, let's see. Just another activity that we had here, again, a thought activity for something for you guys to do later on, is think about a recent organizational initiative that you've had. Who defined the goals? How did you measure success? And did that definition of success stay the same over time? Oftentimes it doesn't. And as you think about defining goals, I'm sure probably everyone who's worked in a helping profession has heard of SMART goals. One of the things we talk about is making your goals smarter. So not just specific, measurable, actionable, reasonable, and time-bound, but also that they are evaluated and reviewed. That is that incorporation of CQI, that incorporation of continuous progress, continuous improvement, so that we can adjust when necessary. All right. We can go ahead because I think we're running short on time. So this is an example, and you guys will get all of these resources. But we like examples. And one of the tools that Evident Change is really known for is structured decision-making tools that help the decision-making process in child welfare. And so this is an example of a theory of change. And one of the reasons that we put it up here, and it's a lot of circles and a lot of words that I'm not going to go through all the way right now, but one of the things that we want to highlight is that all of these different pieces represent some data that can be collected to answer a question. So we start with a problem, we get to the solution, the vision, and then what the outcome is. And all of these are different places and different ways that we can define the problem, that we can outline the process, and that we can then evaluate. And in all of these places, we ask the question, what kind of data need to be collected for us to accurately be able to talk about this? That's the idea behind data for equity. All right, we can go ahead and go back through that. I know this has been quite a bit. We've gone through a lot. We have a lot of different exercises in here. I think we got a little overzealous because as part of the Data for Equity team, we get really excited about this kind of work. For me, it puts together everything that I love. It puts together helping people. It puts together data and research. And it puts together making sure that we're doing things with an equitable lens and that we are helping people and that our intended consequences are actually the things that happen. So it can be, it's a process that agencies can kind of undergo on their own, and it's something that we work with places to help them figure out the best process for doing that. So I know we've got some time held over for questions, and as you all think of your questions, I do want to go back to Karen's comment or question about intersectionality. And as I said, a really big piece of the work that we do, especially our equity work, is around intersectionality. We talk about the work that we most often do with our Data for Equity partners is really helping them understand their own intersecting identities and how that impacts the work that they do, as well as the intersecting identities of the people that they serve and how that might influence what their experience is. And so one of the most interesting activities that we did when I first started at Evident Change was this idea of starting to outline what all of our identities are. So we went through age and race and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity and status at the organization and socioeconomic status. And we had everyone in the room place themselves in either position of privilege in that category or a position of oppression. So around gender, I'm a woman. Traditionally in this country, that's a position of oppression. At our organization, I'm a senior researcher. That's like the second level down from, from the executive director. So I'm in a position of privilege there. And it was a really interesting exercise for me because it allowed everybody in the room to see that we all operate from a multitude of identities. Usually the identities of privilege take precedence in our interactions, but sometimes, depending on which identity we're talking about, we could be interacting with the world mostly from that identity of oppression. So in terms of thinking about how we interact with each other, how we interact with our clients, it's important for us to really understand those intersecting identities and to understand the intersecting identities of the people that we work with and why some of the things that we think we're doing don't have the impact that we thought they would have. And so that's just a really quick kind of conversation on intersectionality. But the sort of headline of that is that it's a huge part of the equity work that we do with Data for Equity. And it's integral and crucial when thinking about the best ways for us to help the clients that we serve. I don't know if you want to add anything else on intersectionality, Jovan.
No, I didn't. I think you kind of covered it all. Yes.
All right. Were there any other questions that folks had in the chat that we may have missed?
Maybe we can go backwards. There was a question related to the healthcare costs increase activity.
Yes.
And so that was, let's see. So can you share more about the exercise on distribution of the healthcare cost increase? Can you share some information? Oop, I'll go a couple more follow-ups here that might help. Can you share some of the discussion that occurred when you used this activity? Can you share some of the questions you asked participants to guide their thought processes?
Yes, absolutely. So the activity is a 4-page activity. And as I said, it gives us some information about staff, racial composition, about their salaries, and then about how many people fit into each one of those categories. And so a couple of the questions that we give to people in this exercise, some things to consider. How many total staff work for your agency? How many are BIPOC? How many are white? Which subpopulation proportionately makes more than, and we set a line at $60,000. And so the questions that we ask people to consider: what information should be considered when determining how to distribute the increased cost across the staff? Should the increased premium be evenly distributed across everyone? Are there reasonable justifications to allocate the increase differently across staff groups? And then how do you build consensus as a group on the most appropriate choice? Generally, what we see in this activity is a lot of people start thinking about, okay, the people who make more money should carry more of the brunt. But then how does that impact people across race? Is that a differential impact? Does that put too much impact on certain people and not enough on other people? And so it's a really interesting conversation. The punchline of that is there's no one right answer, but it really highlights this idea that all of these, if we want to do things with an equitable lens, these are the types of questions that we have to ask ourselves and the types of things that we have to build consensus around.
Yes, and I think one of the things that I will just add is that we really push the participants in that moment to make a decision. That's very difficult for folks to do at times, especially when we're considering all of these different things. And then we asked how comfortable they were with making that decision. And though everybody makes the decision, there's still some level of uncomfortability around it because all of the options sometimes still feel a little unsettling. And so I think that that's what we're trying to get at, is that this is very difficult work, and yet it's very realistic. There are very realistic discussions and decisions that are being made on a daily basis around this.
Yeah, Jovan's absolutely right. People are very uncomfortable. They don't want to be pushed to make a decision because they're in whatever decision you make, it's most likely not going to be equal. And so how do you justify doing things differently? And I think that's work. Anytime we talk about equity work, people talk about equality versus equity. And one of the ways I like to think about it is that equality oftentimes is about resources, giving everybody the same resources. Equity is about outcomes, for people to have similar outcomes. And sometimes for people to have similar outcomes, you have to do things differently. And oftentimes people are uncomfortable with that. They're like, well, that's not fair. Why are we doing more for this group and less for that group? And so these are real conversations that can be really uncomfortable. But when you think about what equity means to you personally and to your organization, those are the types of questions that you have to grapple with and come up with, what are your values and how are those values supported by the actions, the activities, the initiatives, the interventions that your agency undertakes.
Yes, there's a quote. It goes, equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. And so when we said that to one of our organizations, they said, well, you know what, where we are, we don't even need shoes. We need sandals. Some folks need sandals. Some folks need shoes. And if you're like in Canada or Alaska, you might need some snow boots. So
that's right.
Right.
We
We
need some
can't give the
boots in
same
Alaska.
thing to everyone. And that also speaks to the differences that we have and the diversity that we have when we work with organizations. And so it doesn't require us to move the same way in our work with each of those organizations. So really right sizing the appropriate work plan for each place is going to be important. And that's how we build equity into our model as well.
All right, I have one more question here related to evaluation and CQI. What is the best way or time to evaluate? Monthly, quarterly? What determines how often a business or company should evaluate?
That's a great question. And I wish I had a straight answer for you. The answer is it depends on how you've defined your objectives and the outcomes that you're concerned with. If you're concerned about how implementation is going, then you need to be doing some sort of evaluation on a pretty regular basis, maybe even as often as monthly. If you are more concerned about the outcome, what's happening for people after they've left the program, then you maybe only need to do that once a year or once every 2 years. And so evaluation is really driven. The evaluation questions and methodologies are often driven by the questions you want to answer. What do you want to know about what you're doing, about your process, about your content? And that will tell you how often you evaluate and the methods that you use. The one thing that I will say about methodology is that you want to be collecting all different kinds of data. One form of data tells one story. Numbers can tell us one story about what we're doing and about the clients that are coming to us. We need qualitative data. We need the stories, we need the words to give the context to those numbers. And so that's what I would encourage when you think about evaluation is think about what question do you want answered and what are the ways that you can answer it. And I say pie in the sky. If you could do anything you wanted, how would you get the answer to that question? And think of things that don't even seem reasonable, because it's in those conversations that you figure out the best ways to get the data that you need to answer your questions.
I completely agree, Charlene. I would just add that in child welfare, because we have a social service practice team that works in child welfare, and for our specific safety and risk assessment, when we're trying to determine if the risk assessment is doing what we think it will do and capturing the information that we think it will capture, we usually look at a sample size from 12 to 18 months, because that is enough time to really capture any trends, any patterns for the families. And the families are usually some of the families at this time might be working with the particular department for an extensive period of time. So in that case, it would be good to have a longer waiting period for analyzing the data in order to come to some real efficient conclusions around that. And so I think I completely agree. It just depends on what you're measuring and how you're going to capture the best data around it. And so prematurely doing that won't necessarily tell us what we are trying to essentially get at. And that's significant change depending on that objective.
Right.
Great. So we have just 2 minutes left. I'd like to offer each of you a chance to offer any final thoughts or comments.
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for coming, for your attentiveness, for your wonderful questions and comments. As I said before, this is a topic that's near and dear to both Jovan and my hearts. So we really enjoyed ourselves today, and just thank you.
Thanks so much to everyone, all of the participants. Thanks to Training Institutes Live and all of the staff for helping us pull all this off behind the scenes. We appreciate your time. We also know that this was a lot of information, so feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. We have developed a web series and conducted it with different organizations, and we could actually spend at least 90 minutes on each of these phases. So for us to be able to do this all within 90 minutes is we just wanted to give you enough information, but we know that you might still have questions. So please reach out to us if you do. Thank you so much. And thanks for the great feedback during the presentation as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our outstanding presenters, Charlene Taylor and Jovan Goodman, for sharing their expertise and strategies with us today. Also, thank you to our interpreters, Jacqueline and Juliana. And thank you to all of us for joining us, or thank all of you for joining us for this segment for Training Institute Live. If you haven't registered for one of the 2 workshops beginning at 3:30, it's not too late. The registration link is in the chat, and you can use this link to register for future workshops as well. Also, we would very much appreciate you taking a few moments to complete the evaluation for this workshop using the link that is posted in the chat. We take your feedback very seriously, and it will help us to shape the upcoming workshops in this series. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you back after the break and on